The winter of 218 BC descended upon the Po Valley like a cold iron curtain, shrouding the fertile plains of northern Italy in freezing mist and bone-chilling winds. The river Trebia swelled with winter rains, its dark waters churning restlessly through the landscape that had borne witness to countless human struggles across the ages. Yet none of those ancient conflicts could compare to what was about to unfold on these sodden fields. For it was here, in this grey and unforgiving terrain, that two civilizations stood on the precipice of collision, two empires whose enmity would reshape the very foundation of Mediterranean power. Rome, the ascending titan of the Italian peninsula, and Carthage, the ancient maritime empire of North Africa, were about to engage in the first great land battle of the Second Punic War, a conflict that would determine not merely territorial supremacy, but the trajectory of Western civilization itself. To understand the magnitude of what transpired at Trebia, one must first comprehend the profound depths of hatred that existed between these two powers. The animosity was not born overnight, nor was it the product of a single grievance. The roots of Roman-Carthaginian hostility stretched back decades, entangled in commerce, territorial ambition, and the bitter residue of the First Punic War. That earlier conflict, which concluded in 241 BC, had been a catastrophic humiliation for Carthage. Rome had seized Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, islands that had been vital nodes in Carthage's trading empire. More devastating than the territorial losses was the crushing indemnity Rome imposed, a financial burden so severe it threatened to strangle Carthaginian recovery for generations. The peace that followed was not reconciliation, but a temporary cessation of violence, a fragile truce that both sides knew would eventually shatter. Carthage, however, was not a power content to accept defeat. While Rome celebrated its newfound dominance over the Western Mediterranean, Carthaginian commanders turned their gaze toward Iberia, the mineral-rich lands of modern-day Spain and Portugal. There, the Barcid family, led by Hamilcar Barca and later his son-in-law Hasdrubal and his son Hannibal, rebuilt Carthaginian strength. They forged a new empire in Iberia, mining its silver, recruiting its fierce warriors, and transforming what had been a commercial outpost into a military powerhouse capable of challenging Rome once more. The city of Carthage itself remained a hub of wealth and culture, its harbors bristling with merchant vessels, its coffers replenished by Iberian riches, and its leadership seething with the desire for retribution. Rome, by contrast, had grown arrogant in victory. The Senate believed Carthage thoroughly broken, a spent force relegated to the margins of Mediterranean affairs. Roman expansion continued unchecked across the Italian peninsula and into the Adriatic, consolidating alliances and subjugating rival city-states. The Roman military machine, built on the foundation of the citizen soldier and the legendary discipline of the legions, seemed invincible. Roman commanders saw themselves as inheritors of a manifest destiny, destined to impose order upon the chaotic world beyond their borders. This hubris would prove costly. The spark that ignited the Second Punic War came from the Iberian city of Saguntum. This city, though located within Carthage's sphere of influence south of the Ebro River, had aligned itself with Rome, providing the Senate with a pretext to meddle in Iberian affairs. When Hannibal Barca laid siege to Saguntum in 219 BC, Rome issued demands for his withdrawal. Hannibal, however, was not a man inclined toward submission. He was the son of Hamilcar Barca, a commander who had made his children swear eternal enmity toward Rome. Hannibal's entire existence had been shaped by preparation for this confrontation. He ignored Roman threats, and after an 8-month siege, Saguntum fell. Rome declared war, expecting to fight in Iberia or North Africa, never imagining the audacity of what Hannibal planned next. Rather than await a Roman invasion, Hannibal decided to bring the war to Italy itself. In the spring of 218 BC, he assembled an army of approximately 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and several dozen war elephants, then embarked on one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in human history. He marched his multinational force from New Carthage in Iberia, through southern Gaul, and across the towering Alps into the Po Valley. The journey was a nightmare of endurance. Alpine tribes ambushed his columns, rock slides crushed men and animals, snowstorms blinded and froze entire units, and starvation claimed thousands. By the time Hannibal descended into northern Italy, his army had been reduced to roughly 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of surviving elephants. Yet those who remained were hardened beyond measure, veterans tempered by the most brutal natural adversity imaginable. Rome was caught entirely off guard. The Senate had dispatched 2 consular armies for the campaigning season of 218 BC. One, commanded by Publius Cornelius Scipio, was tasked with confronting Hannibal in Iberia. The other, led by Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was assigned to invade North Africa and strike at Carthage directly. Scipio's force embarked from Pisae and sailed toward Massilia, modern Marseille, expecting to intercept Hannibal in southern Gaul. But when Scipio's scouts arrived at the Rhone River, they discovered with alarm that Hannibal had already crossed and was moving toward the Alps. Scipio, realizing the Carthaginian commander had outmaneuvered him entirely, made the decision to send the bulk of his army onward to Iberia under his brother Gnaeus, while he himself returned to northern Italy with a small contingent to prepare defenses. Scipio's return to the Po Valley marked the beginning of Rome's desperate improvisation. He took command of the legions stationed there, forces originally intended to pacify the local Gallic tribes, and repositioned his army near the Ticinus River to intercept Hannibal's advance. But Scipio underestimated the speed and ferocity of Hannibal's cavalry. The 2 armies met in a cavalry skirmish near the Ticinus in November 218 BC, a minor engagement that nonetheless carried profound consequences. Hannibal's Numidian light horsemen, masters of hit-and-run tactics, combined with his heavier Iberian and Libyan cavalry to overwhelm the Roman mounted forces. Scipio himself was gravely wounded in the melee, struck by a spear and surrounded by enemy riders. He would have been captured or killed had his 17-year-old son, the future Scipio Africanus, not rallied a desperate countercharge to rescue his father. The Romans retreated in disarray, and Scipio withdrew his army to a fortified camp near the confluence of the Trebia and Po rivers, awaiting reinforcement. Tiberius Sempronius Longus received urgent orders to abandon the planned invasion of Africa and march north immediately. His army, fresh and eager for action, had been poised to strike at the heart of Carthaginian power. Now, instead, Longus' force marched his legions northward through Italy at breakneck speed, arriving in the Po Valley by early December. The junction of the 2 consular armies gave Rome numerical parity with Hannibal, approximately 40,000 men on each side. Roman confidence surged. Longus, a man of aggressive temperament and political ambition, believed the time had come to crush this foreign invader and claim the glory of victory. Scipio, still recovering from his wounds, counseled patience. He understood that winter was setting in, that Hannibal's supply lines were tenuous, and that time favored Rome. He advocated for a defensive posture, urging his colleague to wait until spring when reinforcements could arrive and Hannibal's Gallic allies, notoriously unreliable, might desert. But Longus was not a man inclined toward caution. He desired battle, craved the triumph that would elevate his political career, and dismissed Scipio's warnings as the excessive prudence of a wounded man. Hannibal understood his enemy with a clarity that bordered on clairvoyance. He had studied Roman tactics, Roman psychology, and Roman leadership. He knew the Romans favored direct confrontation, trusted in the superiority of their heavy infantry, and often allowed personal ambition to override strategic sense. In Longus, Hannibal saw a commander driven by impatience and pride, a man who could be manipulated into fighting on Carthaginian terms. And so, Hannibal devised a trap, a stratagem that would exploit every Roman weakness while maximizing his own advantages. The battlefield Hannibal selected was a flat expanse on the western bank of the Trebia River, an area that offered clear sightlines for his cavalry and room to maneuver. On the southern edge of this plain lay a section of forested and broken terrain, dense thickets and low hills that provided concealment. It was here that Hannibal positioned his secret weapon, a force of 2,000 men, 1,000 Numidian cavalry, and 1,000 select infantry, placed under the command of his younger brother, Mago Barca. These troops were ordered to remain hidden until the decisive moment, to emerge only when the Roman army was fully committed to battle and unable to respond to a rear assault. The ambush was meticulously planned, the timing critical, and the concealment absolute. On the morning of the battle, likely in late December 218 BC, Hannibal set his trap in motion. Before dawn, he dispatched his Numidian light cavalry across the Trebia River toward the Roman camp. These horsemen, mounted on swift, agile steeds and armed with javelins, were masters of harassment. They galloped up to the Roman fortifications, hurled their missiles into the camp, shouted insults, and then wheeled away before the Romans could mount an effective response. The javelins clattered against shields and tents, wounding sentries and sowing confusion. The attacks were repeated in waves, each incursion designed to provoke and enrage. Longus took the bait exactly as Hannibal had anticipated. The consul, already eager for battle, interpreted the Numidian raids as a sign of Carthaginian desperation, or perhaps as an insult that demanded immediate retaliation. Without consulting Scipio, without allowing his men to eat breakfast or conduct the proper pre-battle rituals, Longus ordered the entire army to assemble and march out. It was a catastrophic error born of pride and haste. The Roman soldiers, roused from their tents in the freezing pre-dawn darkness, were hurried into formation and driven toward the river. They had not eaten. They had not warmed themselves by fires. They had not mentally or physically prepared for the ordeal ahead. The Trebia River, in late December, was a roiling, icy torrent, swollen by weeks of winter rains. The water level reached chest height in places, the current strong enough to knock men off balance. As the Roman army waded into the river, the cold was immediate and brutal. Armor and weapons, already heavy, became almost unbearable as wool and leather soaked through. Fingers stiffened, grips weakened, muscles cramped. Soldiers struggled to maintain formation as the current tugged at their legs and the freezing water sapped their strength. By the time the Roman legions emerged on the western bank, they were soaked, shivering, exhausted before the battle had even begun. Their teeth chattered, their limbs trembled, and their bodies burned precious energy simply trying to stay warm. Across the plain, Hannibal's army waited in stark contrast. His men had risen early, eaten hot meals, and warmed themselves by campfires. They had rubbed oil into their skin to guard against the cold and prepared their weapons with care. They stood in formation, rested and ready, watching as the bedraggled Roman army struggled onto the battlefield. Hannibal himself moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement, reminding them of the justice of their cause and the riches that awaited them in victory. His presence was magnetic, his confidence infectious. The Carthaginians, though drawn from diverse nations and cultures, fought under a commander they trusted implicitly. The Roman army assembled into its traditional formation, the triplex aces, a three-line deployment that had served Rome well in countless engagements. At the front stood the hastati, younger soldiers in the prime of their physical strength, eager to prove themselves. They formed the first line, shields locked, pila, heavy javelins gripped in their right hands. Behind them stood the Principes, more experienced legionaries in their late 20s and 30s, men who had seen battle before and knew its rhythm. The third line consisted of the Triarii, grizzled veterans who served as the army's anchor, the final reserve to be committed only in desperate circumstances. Roman doctrine held that if a battle reached the Triarii, the situation was already dire. The center of the Roman line, approximately 20,000 heavy infantry, was flanked by roughly 16,000 allied Italian troops, lighter infantry drawn from Rome's network of subjugated and allied states. On the far wings, Longus positioned his cavalry, approximately 4,000 horsemen, a force he believed sufficient to contest Hannibal's mounted arm. Hannibal's deployment was more complex, a reflection of both his multinational army and his tactical ingenuity. At the center, he placed approximately 8,000 Gallic tribesmen, warriors recently recruited from the Celtic tribes of the Po Valley. These men fought with fierce courage, but lacked the discipline and heavy armor of professional soldiers. They wielded long, slashing swords, carried oval shields, and often fought bare-chested, even in winter, their bodies painted with wood. Hannibal knew this center was his weakest point, vulnerable to the crushing weight of the Roman legions. On his right flank, he positioned 11,000 African and Libyan infantry, elite troops who had fought in Iberia and survived the Alpine crossing. These were professional soldiers, equipped with captured Roman gear in many cases, disciplined and deadly. On his left flank stood 10,000 Iberian infantry, fierce warriors from the tribes of modern Spain and Portugal, men who fought with falcata swords and small round shields, renowned for their ferocity in close combat. But Hannibal's true advantage lay in his cavalry. On his left wing, he stationed 3,000 Iberian horsemen, heavy cavalry capable of shock charges and sustained melee. On his right wing, he deployed 4,000 Libyan cavalry, similarly equipped for close combat. Most critically, spread across both wings, were approximately 4,000 Numidian light cavalry, the finest skirmishing horsemen in the Mediterranean world. These Numidians rode without saddles or bridles, controlling their mounts with knee pressure alone, and carried bundles of javelins which they could hurl with devastating accuracy while riding at full gallop. They were masters of feigned retreat, capable of luring enemy cavalry into pursuits and then turning to strike with lethal precision. Hannibal also retained a handful of war elephants, perhaps fewer than a dozen, the survivors of the Alpine ordeal. These beasts were positioned to support the cavalry, their psychological impact often as valuable as their physical power. The battle began with the clash of skirmishers, the velites on the Roman side and light infantry on the Carthaginian. Longus, impatient to close with the enemy, sent his skirmishers forward at a near sprint, partly to engage the enemy and partly to warm their freezing bodies through exertion. The velites, young men armed with javelins and small shields, rushed across the muddy field and met Hannibal's Balearic slingers, Numidian javelin throwers, and light African infantry in the center of the plain. The air filled with the whistle of sling stones and the hiss of javelins. Men fell, struck in the face, throat, and chest. The skirmish lines swayed back and forth, neither side gaining a decisive advantage. After several minutes of intense but indecisive fighting, both forces disengaged, the skirmishers retreating through the gaps in their respective heavy infantry lines. Now the main lines have advanced. The Roman legions marched forward with mechanical precision, their cadence maintained by centurions barking orders, their formation tight despite exhaustion and cold. The ground beneath their feet was slick with mud and frost. The hastati in the front line lowered their pila, ready to hurl them at close range before drawing swords for melee combat. Across from them, the Gallic center braced for impact, warriors shouting war cries, pounding sword hilts against shields, invoking their gods and ancestors. The distance closed, 50 paces, 30, 20, and then, with a deafening crash, the lines collided. The impact was catastrophic for the Gauls. The Roman hastati hurled their pila in a coordinated volley just before contact, the heavy javelins punching through shields and armor, some piercing flesh and bone, others embedding so deeply in wooden shields that they became unusable, their soft iron shanks bending on impact to prevent the enemy from throwing them back. Then the hastati drew their gladii, the short thrusting swords that were Rome's signature weapon, and drove into the Gallic line with brutal efficiency. Roman infantry combat was methodical and relentless. They advanced in tight formation, shields overlapping, stabbing forward with short, controlled thrusts designed to penetrate gaps in enemy defenses. The Gauls, by contrast, fought with wild courage but less cohesion. Their long, slashing swords required room to swing, space that did not exist in the crush of close combat. Within minutes, the Gallic center was suffering horrific casualties. The numerical and qualitative superiority of the Roman center became immediately apparent. The hastati pushed forward, stepping over Gallic corpses, driving deeper into the Carthaginian line. Behind them, the Principes moved up to support, filling gaps, relieving exhausted men, maintaining the relentless pressure. The Gauls fought with desperate courage, but they were outmatched. Hannibal had placed them in an impossible position, knowingly or otherwise, and they were being slaughtered. The Carthaginian center began to buckle, then bend, then give ground steadily. The Romans sensed victory. Longus, observing from the rear, believed the battle was already won. His legions were carving through the enemy center, exactly as Roman doctrine predicted. But on the flanks, the situation was unfolding very differently. The Roman allied infantry engaged Hannibal's African and Iberian troops and found themselves in brutal, grinding stalemates. These were not the lightly armed Gauls, but professional soldiers who matched the Romans in discipline and surpassed them in experience. The fighting on the flanks was vicious and indecisive, neither side able to break the other, and crucially, the Roman cavalry had not yet engaged. Hannibal had deliberately held his cavalry back, waiting for the precise moment when the entire Roman army would be locked in melee, unable to maneuver or respond to a sudden shock. When Hannibal judged the moment right, he unleashed his cavalry in a coordinated assault on both Roman wings simultaneously. The 3,000 Iberian horsemen on the Carthaginian left and the 4,000 Libyan horsemen on the right thundered forward, while the Numidian light cavalry swept wide, preparing to harass and encircle. The Roman cavalry, only 4,000 strong and already demoralized by the earlier defeat at Ticinus, found themselves outnumbered and outclassed. The clash was chaotic and one-sided. Carthaginian heavy cavalry smashed into the Roman horsemen with the weight of their charge, unhorsing riders, trampling fallen men, cutting down those who tried to fight back. Simultaneously, the Numidians circled at distance, hurling javelins into the flanks and rear of the Roman cavalry, striking horses and riders alike. The Roman horsemen had no answer to this combined assault. They were being struck from multiple directions, overwhelmed by superior numbers and superior tactics. At the same moment, Hannibal ordered his surviving war elephants forward to support the cavalry assault. These massive African beasts, each standing over 3 meters tall, were terrifying weapons of psychological warfare. Their trumpeting roars, their sheer size, and the unpredictability of their movements struck fear into men and horses alike. However, the Roman velites, who had withdrawn behind the main line after the initial skirmish, were well equipped to deal with elephants. They darted forward, hurling javelins at the great beasts, targeting their eyes, trunks, and legs. Several elephants fell, pierced by multiple missiles. Others panicked, the pain driving them into frenzied stampedes that trampled friend and foe indiscriminately. The elephant assault, while dramatic, was ultimately ineffective, the creatures more a liability than an asset in the chaos of battle. But the failure of the elephants mattered little because the cavalry battle was already decided. The Roman horsemen, bloodied and broken, began to flee. Entire squadrons turned and galloped away from the field, some attempting to recross the Trebia, others scattering into the countryside. The Carthaginian cavalry pursued for a time, cutting down stragglers, but Hannibal had given them more important orders. Rather than chase fleeing enemies, the cavalry wheeled inward, turning their attention to the flanks and rear of the Roman infantry. The Roman army, still locked in combat with the Carthaginian center and flanks, was now completely exposed on its wings. Longus, watching from his command position, saw his cavalry disintegrate, and panic seized him. The sight of thousands of horsemen fleeing, the realization that his army's flanks were now unprotected, and worst of all, the sudden emergence of fresh Carthaginian forces from the southern tree line, all of this shattered his confidence. Mago Barca's hidden troops, 2,000 strong, burst from concealment and charged into the rear of the Roman army. They struck with complete surprise, their war cries echoing across the battlefield, their weapons cutting down Roman soldiers who had no idea an enemy force was behind them. The trap was sprung. The Roman army was now surrounded on three sides. Carthaginian cavalry pressed in from the left and right. Mago's ambush force attacked from the rear, and ahead, the African and Iberian infantry on the flanks began to close inward, contracting the space available to the Romans. Panic spread through the Roman allied troops on the flanks. These men, many of them conscripts from subjugated Italian cities, had no deep loyalty to Rome and little desire to die in a losing battle. They began to break, first in small groups, then in entire cohorts. Thousands of allied soldiers threw down their weapons and fled, some attempting to fight their way back to Trebia, others simply running in blind terror. Longus himself abandoned the field. The consul, recognizing that the battle was lost and fearing capture, spurred his horse and fled toward the Roman camp at Placentia, accompanied by a small retinue of cavalry. His departure was a final, devastating blow to Roman morale. The army's commander had deserted them. Only the Roman legions at the center, the Hastati, Principes, and Triarii, who formed the core of the army, maintained cohesion. These men, professional soldiers bound by discipline and pride, refused to surrender. They were still advancing, still driving the remnants of the Gallic center before them, even as their own army disintegrated around them. Approximately 10,000 Roman legionaries, the survivors of the center, realized their only hope of survival lay in punching through the Carthaginian line and escaping. They formed into a compact mass, a fighting square, and drove forward with renewed ferocity. The Gallic center, already shattered and depleted, could not hold against this final desperate push. The Roman square broke through, trampling the last Gallic resistance, and began a fighting withdrawal toward the northeast, toward the Roman colony of Placentia. Hannibal's troops attempted to pursue, but the Roman legionaries fought every step of the way, maintaining formation, turning periodically to drive off attackers. The discipline that had made Rome great now saved these men from annihilation. They marched through freezing rain and across hostile territory, harassed by Numidian cavalry and Gallic warbands, but they reached Placentia. Of the 10,000 who broke through, most survived, a testament to their training and courage. The rest of the Roman army was not so fortunate. Thousands of soldiers, particularly the allied contingents, were cut down in the rout. Men fled in all directions, many attempting to recross the Trebia. The river, swollen and icy, became a death trap. Soldiers, weighed down by armor and weakened by exhaustion, waded into the current and were swept away, dragged under by the weight of their equipment, or succumbed to hypothermia in the freezing water. Bodies floated downstream for days afterward. Others were hunted down by Carthaginian cavalry, Numidians riding through the countryside spearing fleeing Romans, Gallic tribesmen seeking revenge for past Roman aggression. Thousands more were captured, rounded up, and herded into makeshift prison camps. The scale of the disaster was immense. Roman casualties at Trebia were catastrophic. Ancient sources, though imprecise, suggest that Rome lost at least 20,000 men killed, drowned, or captured. The Allied contingents were virtually annihilated. Only the 10,000 legionaries who fought their way out survived intact. Carthaginian losses, by contrast, were relatively light. The Gallic centre had been mauled, with perhaps 4,000 dead or wounded, but Hannibal's African, Iberian, and Numidian troops had suffered minimal casualties. The battle was a stunning victory for Carthage and a humiliating defeat for Rome. The consequences of Trebia rippled across Italy and the Mediterranean. For Hannibal, the victory secured his position in the Po Valley and validated his strategic audacity. Gallic tribes that had remained neutral now flocked to his banner, eager to join what appeared to be a winning cause. Thousands of Gallic warriors swelled Hannibal's ranks, replacing the losses he had suffered crossing the Alps. The victory also demonstrated to the wider world that Rome, the supposedly invincible power, could be defeated in open battle. Hannibal had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought a numerically equal Roman army. For Rome, Trebia was a shock that reverberated through the Senate and the streets of the city. Sempronius Longus returned to Rome in disgrace, his political career in ruins, his reputation as a commander destroyed. Scipio's warnings had been vindicated, but vindication brought little comfort. The defeat exposed critical weaknesses in Roman military doctrine. Roman commanders had relied too heavily on the strength of their infantry, underestimated the importance of cavalry, and allowed personal ambition to override strategic caution. More troubling still was the realization that Hannibal was not merely a capable general, but a tactical genius, a commander who understood his enemy better than they understood themselves. The Battle of Trebia was the first of 3 catastrophic defeats Rome would suffer at Hannibal's hands. The following year, at Lake Trasimene, Hannibal would ambush and annihilate another Roman army. 2 years later, at Cannae, he would achieve his masterpiece, a double envelopment that destroyed the largest army Rome had ever fielded. But Trebia was where it all began. It was Hannibal's first great set-piece battle in Italy, the opening movement of a symphony of destruction that would bring Rome to the brink of collapse. Trebia revealed the essential elements of Hannibal's genius, his ability to read terrain and use it to his advantage, positioning Mago's ambush force where it could strike with maximum effect. His psychological insight, understanding that Sempronius could be provoked into fighting on Carthaginian terms. His tactical flexibility, coordinating infantry, cavalry, and concealed reserves into a seamless whole. And perhaps most importantly, his patience, the willingness to endure punishment at the center in order to achieve envelopment on the flanks. These qualities would define Hannibal's campaigns in Italy and earn him a place among the greatest military commanders in history. For the Roman soldiers who survived Trebia, the battle was a nightmare they would carry for the rest of their lives. The freezing river, the endless cold, the sight of their comrades falling by the hundreds, the panic as the trap closed around them, these memories haunted Roman veterans. But Rome, for all its flaws, possessed a quality that Carthage ultimately lacked: resilience. Rome would absorb this defeat and the others that followed. It would learn from its mistakes, adapt its tactics, and eventually produce commanders capable of matching Hannibal. But in the winter of 218 BC, none of that was certain. What was certain was that a Carthaginian army stood victorious on Italian soil, and its commander had just announced to the world that Rome could bleed. The frozen fields of Trebia, stained red with the blood of thousands, bore silent witness to the first act of a war that would rage for 17 years and reshape the ancient world. Hannibal had delivered his opening statement, and it was written in Roman blood.